Hi, I'm Fristellium, and in this video I'm going to be looking at the traits on the Unholy Artefact weapon. In the interest of time, I'm going to assume you already know what the artifacts are and how they work, so rather than going through the traits in order, I'm going to split them up into groups depending on their impact to gameplay. But, as the numbers keep changing, I'm not going to worry too much about that at this stage. Let's begin with the traits that have no gameplay impact at all, or are purely providing damage inflation. For ability damage, there are Plague Bearer increases the damage of Virulent Plague, Rotten Touch increases the damage of Festering Strike, and Deadliest Coil increases the damage of Death Coil. These individual ability increases are standard across all artifact weapons. This type of thing was usually handled within the character leveling process and would show up as a slightly larger number in the tooltip, which you wouldn't notice. Since your total damage is being balanced around having all 3 ranks of each, it's basically the same as not having any ranks at all. So I'm left assuming these are here to massage player psychology when adding a relic because it looks better to see 20% increased damage rather than just 5%. There is also a generic trait for increasing total damage that has appeared on all weapons, but I'm not sure if this is increasing passively as you use power to level traits, or if it's a sync for excess power after you finish leveling. Maybe it's both. There are some mitigations. Unholy Endurance reduces the damage taken from AoE, and Deadly Durability reduces damage taken. Not sure if that's a flat reduction that stacks with Unholy Endurance, but it's likely just to be direct damage. I haven't found reductions like this on other classes, but it is possible I could have just missed them. But these are here to help with any extra damage you take from being slow. There is also a main trait in this category, the Shambler. Your attacks have a chance to summon a super zombie that shambles forwards and explodes. It's passive to summon, walks a short distance, and falls over. I can't tell you anything about the explosion, as it doesn't seem to be working, but I would hope that it's either wide enough to catch targets or at least walks in the right direction to explode, because you can't control it, or the location of the target that spawned it, from moving away. There's a couple of traits that just make it out of this group but don't really belong anywhere else. Eternal Agony increases the duration of Dark Transformation by a few seconds. A longer uptime on DT is good, but it doesn't really influence decision making. The other is Gravitational Pull. Enemies you Death Grip are snared by 80% for 6 seconds. This is a PvP trait, as it's a free and slightly stronger Chains of Ice. The next group are traits where I don't have a clear enough picture of where to put them. The Darkest Crusade increases the effect of Rune of the Fallen Crusader. Rune Forging is in, but this doesn't seem to be in effect yet. It's currently down as 21% at 3 ranks, so if this is an additive increase like the Enhanced Crusader effect from Warlords, that would make it 41% increased strength in total, which is quite large. Add in another 3 ranks from Relics, and that could be 62%, so whilst I'm unsure where the cutoff for this is going to be, that seems very unlikely. A multiplicative effect would put the same 6 ranks at around 30% in total, which is a 10% increase to the current Crusader and closer to the realms of possibility. But with this increase in effect, I don't know if there are any other changes, because if the rate drops it becomes more like a trinket effect, and that will start influencing cooldown use. Armies of the Damned. Ghouls summoned by Army of the Dead now apply additional effects. These effects are 4 debuffs applied to the target. 10% extra damage taken, 10% reduced damage dealt, 10% reduced healing taken, and a damage over time. Each of these effects last 5 seconds, and there can be multiple versions of the same debuff. I don't know if these effects are shareable by other players, or how this will affect bosses, because it could lead to some awkward connotations, such as only bringing Unholy Death Knights to cast Army for either extra raid damage or survivability. But since it's random which debuff is up, the raid could end up bringing a couple just to Army 1 tricky phase, or spread them across several and hope they get the right debuffs at the right time. But then I don't know if they stack between DKs, or if casting multiple armies is only increasing the chance of the right buff being present. I've also had 3 or so randomly summoned ghouls up at a time, so these debuffs will be cycling through the whole fight to some extent. But having to tune encounters for completely random spikes where the raid does 30% more damage or the boss deals 30% less damage seems incredibly awkward. So whilst this has made Army do something useful, I'm a little uncertain about the type of utility it actually brings. Portal to the Underworld. Army of the Dead ghouls explode when they die. This is not yet implemented, but should be counting the ghouls randomly summoned by the weapon, as the other ones are. Since you have no control over those, there is no point worrying about that aspect of it. The only controllable side is from casting Army, but because of the quantity of those summoned at one time, I will have to assume the explosion damage is going to be low and split between targets. If it isn't, there could be a very weird situation where you summon army well before the pool to hit an AoE mark, but I expect wanting the maximum debuff uptime would keep that from happening. And now we arrive at the last few traits that actually impact gameplay in some form. The first trait is the ability gained from the weapon. It was Apocalypse, but that has been changed into a cooldown that causes all pestilent explosions within a short duration to summon an army of the Dead Ghoul. This has been announced, but isn't in this build for testing. Conveniently, they chose a language that doesn't match any abilities, but Virulent Plague is worded as an eruption, whereas Festering Wounds are worded as Pestilent Lesions, so we can assume that Bursting Wounds are summoning ghouls. This does tie in a lot better with the mechanics overall, and can reasonably expected to provide around 10 ghouls single target, given either Defile or Soul Reaper. AoE should provide quite a few ghouls when combined with Stacking Wounds multi-target. The damage from each ghoul is still totally pointless. The focus is on the various debuffs they bring from what is essentially a mini army. Double Doom. Sudden Doom can stack to 2 and will proc 25% more frequently. The stacking is a good quality of life change. The increased proc chance will raise the number of times you can roll for Runic Corruption, which will of course help keep downtime to a minimum, but also implying they expect there to be enough downtime spread around that you'll need to store up procs to fill it. Runic Tattoo's current iteration increases your runic power cap by 15 and generation by 10% at 3 ranks. Every rune now generates 11 runic power, and wounds generate 5.5. The runic power from each wound is shown rounded down as 5, but calculated at 5.5. So if you break 2 wounds, both will show 5 runic power, but upon breaking the second, you get the correct total of 11 runic power. There is only one DPS ability using runic power, Death Coil. Any increases to resource generation without a corresponding increase in cost will of course result in casting more Death Coils, but at 10% you are more likely to notice it in total casts rather than sudden gluts of runic power during gameplay. And of course this will mean you have more total rolls for Runic Corruption. Scourge the Unbeliever gives Scourge Strike a chance to refund a rune. Currently 10% at 3 ranks. Previously it was 10% per rank, which made it incredibly strong. But I'm not entirely sure what it says about the artifact as a whole that this strongest trait is basically putting runic empowerment onto Scourge Strike. The class revolves around runes, and this gives your primary ability a chance to fund itself, which would help downtime and make players think more about managing the wound stack. It was the only trait that really caught my attention, but after its nerf it's more of an occasional perk than something you can build around. The third main trait is in this group, Scourge of Worlds. Death Coil applies a debuff that increases Scourge Strike damage by 50%. This was previously known as Flagellation. I can only assume the name change was down to a fear of mispronouncing it in public, or the public mispronouncing it. You would be forgiven for thinking this trait was good, but it's not. First of all, I want to make it clear that having Scourge Strike deal extra damage single target is not the problem. The problem is the implementation. So let's start with the debuff. It's on the target and the duration is 6 seconds long. It starts the moment Death Coil hits, which is immediately because we're in melee range. With the global as is, you get 4 casts during this uptime before you need to reapply it, which in theory is okay because with 3 runes per set, it only takes 2 or 3 runes to get enough runic power to cast Death Coil and reapply it. But there are flaws in all aspects of gameplay. Mechanically, it can interfere with rune regen, because there are times with Runic Corruption that you don't want it to proc, as it would waste rune recharge time. But the debuff needs to be there, so you can end up capping runes reapplying it. Granted, with the uniform rune type, this is less destructive than in Warlords, but as the only remaining piece of rune management, it's irritating. You always want to match Scourge with the debuff, but when you introduce small delays of just a few seconds between casting Death Coil and Scourge Strike, the system starts to break down. The most common form of this is movement, meaning you are forced to take Clawing Shadows. But it also breaks core mechanics at a fundamental level. If you have capped wounds, 30 runic power, but no runes, and the next set of runes are 5 seconds away or longer, a common enough situation if you went Scourge Fester on that set, you should be using Death Coil to fill that time to try and proc Runic Corruption, so you could start Scourge Striking. But you won't, because the debuff would run out before you can reapply it, and then you would lose buffed Scourge Strikes. So Death Coil, apparently designed to fill out the rotation and bring back runes, fails because you are holding it to use with runes. But we're still not done, because the current form of Unholy has a few issues with AoE, and this doesn't help. We're going to get bogged down in minutiae a little more, but please bear with me. Because it is a debuff attached to the target, you would be inclined to try and throw some coils out to try and spread it multi-target before AoE to increase the Scorch Cleave. But it's only 6 seconds, or 4 buffed casts. Every global used to spread coil has to be deducted from the time of the first debuff, but you also need to hit Outbreak and Death and Decay, and after that, you only press Scorch Strike. Assuming adds arrive as you place Death and Decay. Working backwards, you can automatically deduct 1 global for D&D, so putting coil here gives 3 Scourges left. If you need to put diseases up with Outbreak, that also lasts 6 seconds. Putting that behind coil is 2 casts before adds, which means you have roughly 3 seconds for Plague to hit all targets, which with accurate timers is risky but plausible. But it's unrealistic to put an off-target coil ahead of that, as you'd only have roughly 2 seconds to infect all targets, which is now pushing it. And by placing off-target coil 3 casts behind D&D, you're only going to get 1 buffed hit of Scorch Strike cleaved onto the off-target. Switching places will get 2 buff Scourges at a significant risk of not spreading Plague, so the AoE open is strictly timed and will look like coil off-target, Outbreak, coil main target, D&D, cleave, all to gain a single buffed hit on the off-target. But that is assuming you can time out the adds arriving flawlessly. Any delays and you're screwed. It's more than likely to just give up on the effort and keep it single target, which could be its intention. So ignoring multi-target, a duration this short will drop off the main target after a few seconds anyway, and there is no way you would stop casting Scorch Strike during cleave to reapply it, unless of course you were weaving because you ran out of runes and were trying to bait corruption, which is entirely possible given you lose 2 runes setting up AoE with no way of replacing them. There is no quick fix for this. The easy dial is to extend the duration, and whilst that does put coil back into its place as filler, that would make spreading the debuff before AoE an expectation factored into tuning, and that would make AoE preparation even more tedious, requiring players to follow a strict cast order with mouse over death coil macros. The other solution is to turn it into a buff on the player, and extend the duration, solving all of the issues raised, but then it just becomes a standard passive. And if this is the best solution, why isn't it simply part of Scorch Strike's tooltip? Think Howling Blast, does X damage to the primary target and Y damage to other targets. If Scorch Strike had X times 1.5 to the primary target and X to the other targets during D&D, there is nothing more to worry about with it. Maybe they don't want players to notice that Scorch Strike has already become a restricted Howling Blast. But that's all this trait is, a shit version of a standard tooltip. But it's also a major trait, taking up space from an idea that could have been genuinely interesting. Okay, with all traits done, there's really just 2 things left. The first is working out which traits are worth adding relics to, and of course the assumption will be that all relics are placed into the same trait. But since all the numbers keep changing, there's little point worrying about specifics right now, but we can work through hypotheticals. It's back to looking at damage, runes, and runic power. There is no mastery trait to increase shadow damage, which would have been my go-to, but there is a dial to increase strength through Fallen Crusader. Individual ability damage is down to the quantity they are used, and that ratio can be changed by the set bonuses, but it's unlikely to be any of those. Runes are affected by the chance to proc off Scorch Strike. Runic power is increased in both capacity and generation, which will increase the quantity of runic corruption procs, also affecting runes, assuming you have the globals free to cast Death Coil. My expectation is that it will be between Scourge the Unbeliever and runic tattoos. More runic power will increase the overall speed of your rotation without fundamentally changing it, whilst proccing runes will focus more on wound stack management. The final question is which route to take to unlock traits. Runic power traits are along the bottom, damage traits are along the top, so I would be inclined to stay along the top rail, starting with Rotten Touch, heading down towards Scourge of Worlds, then back up and along over the top into the runic power rail, picking up the single rank traits along the way. Final numbers will of course impact this route slightly, and it will also depend on the rate you acquire power versus your raid schedule. Whilst it's going to be a regular question, since it's going to be completely filled out, it's only really going to matter in the first few weeks. So in conclusion, I don't think this is any better or worse than any other weapon. Structurally, they're all quite bland. They have lots of shiny art designs, most of which I quite like, and I don't think the concept itself is bad. But at best the trees are essentially the old system of incrementalism that was thrown away years ago. And at worst, they are a very cynical view of player choice, creating only the illusion of it. Because as long as you pick something vaguely related to damage, you won't be that far off the best choice, so it doesn't look like it'll make a huge amount of difference which you pick. One of the reasons this took so long to make was that I very quickly realised, and had probably noticed as well, I don't like the artefacts. But you guys asked for it, and I said I would do it. The deductions and information are still quite valid, and I tried to keep it largely objective, although the restraint clearly failed in some places. I've already started work on demonology, which has less moving parts, so hopefully I can get that done faster than the usual 2 or 3 weeks. And I'll bite the bullet and look at Frost's weapon as well. Okay, that pretty much covers everything. Feel free to add any questions or comments. Thanks for watching.